name is Dr. Caroline Schroeder, and I'm one of the organizers of Douglass Week 2021. And thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're absolutely delighted to welcome you to Douglass Week, and we're very happy to celebrate Frederick Douglass and his journey to Ireland with you today. And we also want to explore the importance of remembering slavery, the intertwined struggle for liberation between Ireland and the US. And we'll do that today with Professor Christian Connealy and Dr. Adrian Mulligan. And just before we start, I just wanted to say a few small things about housekeeping. So it will be about 1 hour. So the event will last about 1 hour. And if you have any questions, on the bottom of your video screen, you should see a little Q&A box. So you can pop in your questions that you might have in there. We'll be monitoring that. So we'll pass the questions on to the panelists. And when there's time for questions, they will, of course, try and answer the questions. And then what else? Yeah, just to let you know that this is going to be recorded as all of our events will be, and it will be available after Douglass Week for everyone to view. And it's also, we're live on YouTube right now. So welcome to all the YouTube watchers and audience as well. So thank you so much for this. I hope that you enjoy this event. I hope that you enjoy Douglass Week. And I will now hand over to Dr. Adrian Mulligan from Bucknell University, who is also a co-organizer of Douglass Week and who will guide us through this conversation, this event. So thank you so much, Adrian. I'll hand over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Caroline. Well, it's my great pleasure to introduce you today, Dr. Christine Connealy. Dr. Connealy is an Irish historian who originally earned her doctorate from Trinity College, Dublin, in which her thesis focused on the introduction of the Poor Laws to Ireland during the 19th century. Subsequently, she worked in educational and research institutes in Dublin, Belfast, and Liverpool, lecturing on the relationship between poverty, famine, and emigration, and publishing quite extensively on the impact of the Great Famine in particular. For example, her groundbreaking 1997 book, This Great Calamity, The Irish Famine, 1845 to 1852, and more recently, Charity and the Great Hunger in Ireland, The Kindness of Strangers. Dr. Kinealy also specializes in other areas of 19th century Irish and Irish American history, for example, focusing on Daniel O'Connell, the Young Ireland Rebellion of 1848, a growing tide of Irish American nationalism during the late 19th century, and of course, abolitionism in Ireland. She has a wonderful book, which is the product of her working tirelessly for many years, collecting the approximately 50-something speeches that Frederick Douglass gave in Ireland, and a more recent one that charts the visits to Ireland, not just of Frederick Douglass, but also of a whole host of other Black activists. Dr. Connealy is currently a professor at Quinnipiac University in Connecticut, where she teaches such courses as Irish Studies, Irish Myths and Legends, and European History. She is also the founding director of Ireland's Great Hunger Institute at Quinnipiac University. In her life and work to date, therefore, I think it's fair to say that Dr. Connealy has proven that history is not dead and buried, but that it can be recovered for purposes of social justice in the present. She is somebody who firmly believes that history can make a difference, that it can be made useful today, and that it can provide precious guidance and precedent if only it can be uncovered and activated. Without further ado, therefore, I would like to introduce you to Dr. Christian Connealy, whose presentation today focuses on Black abolitionists in Cork.
I'm here. I need the host to let me in. I'm sorry. Can you hear me, Adrian?
We can hear you.
Okay, I promise you I'm here.
You're coming.
Okay,
here we go.
Here I am. So
wonderful.
Adrian, thank you. That was a really lovely introduction, and I really appreciate how you sum up my work, because I am a great advocate for social justice and try and use my history in that way. So I just want to start off by congratulating the team who brought this together. It's just an incredible week. I know how much work organizing a 2-day, 3-day conference takes. So to organize something so complex that lasts for a week is really fantastic. So thank you to Caroline, thank you to Adrian, and thank you to everybody else in their team for making this possible. For me, there's a lot of personal satisfaction. As Adrian said, I've moved away from the famine to some extent, and I've been working on abolition for about 12 years. Initially, Daniel O'Connell, but more recently Frederick Douglass, and even more recently Frederick Douglass. My research on him led me to see that a number of other abolitionists came to Ireland between 1790 and 1860. So I've published, I've written about 10 of them. I'm currently working on the next batch of 10 who came, and my work today is very much based on the first 10 who came. So I have a PowerPoint. I know technology isn't always best friends, but I'm going to see if this works. I'm hoping it will, and then I can start. Okay, so I'm going to rely on Adrian to say if we can see that.
Yeah, we can. Thank you, Christine.
Oh, okay, thank you. That didn't sound like Adrian, but whoever said it, thank you very much. So as Adrian said, I work at Quinnipiac University, which is in Connecticut. It's sort of the unpronounceable university. None of my friends can pronounce it, even though they practice. So we're in Connecticut, and our previous president opened a Great Hunger Museum and a Great Hunger Institute. So we are known for our studies on the Great Hunger, and we have a fantastic collection. If the world opens up again, you please come and visit us. At the moment, I am looking at 2 foot of snow outside my window. It's pretty. Okay, so without more ado, let's see if this is going to work for me. And it's about Frederick Douglass. So just briefly, Adrian talked about some of my work. My most recent book, Black Abolitionists in Ireland, where I do look at 10 Black abolitionists, including one incredible woman. I'm going to speak about 4 of them today. And a few years ago, I published Frederick Douglass's speeches. He was just incredible. He did make almost 50 speeches in his 4 months in Ireland. He didn't have notes, and sometimes he would speak for 2 hours without notes. And having transcribed all of his speeches, I can say each one was brilliant and each one was different. He was self-taught and just absolutely remarkable. I also want to thank and pay tribute to the African American Irish Diaspora Network. They're coming up to their first birthday. The founder, Dennis Brownlee, I'm sure he's maybe watching, and just want to pay tribute to the incredible work he has done in the last 12 months. And the African American Irish Diaspora Network, AIDN for short, is one of the co-sponsors of this week. So again, thank you to AIDN for all you've done and all that you plan to do. So without further ado, I'm going to look at 4 abolitionists who came to Ireland, and they came via Britain. They are very, very different, and they are each, as I hope you'll agree by the end of this, pretty remarkable. And they cover a time span from 1791 to 1859. So my first one is Equiano Olaudah. Second one is Charles Riemann. Third one is, of course, the beloved Frederick Douglass. And then the fourth one, Sarah Riemann. And you might notice a similarity in surnames. Charles and Sarah were brother and sister. Very different, both incredible. So I'll just go through this and then we'll have some questions at the end. So Equiano, maybe one of the most famous ones, Black abolitionists after Frederick Douglass. Really interesting story, because unlike a lot of Black abolitionists who grew up in America, he was born in Africa. He and his sister were captured when they were 10 or 11. They never saw each other again. He was taken on by a ship's captain and he worked at sea. He was part of the 7 Years' War. He traveled around the world. He was very cosmopolitan, and he actually was given an income. And so when he was 20 years old, he used that money to purchase his freedom. He decided not to return to Africa or the Caribbean, where he'd been based for a while, but instead he chose to live in England because he knew in England he could not be recaptured and returned to slavery. So he moved to England, and there he became very involved with the abolitionist movement. He became an advisor to Thomas Clarkson, William Wilberforce, etc. And he published a narrative of his life. And it was actually a bestseller. It went through 9 different editions. And in many ways, his narrative provided a template for later Black abolitionists. And if you've ever read Frederick Douglass's narrative, you'll see some similarities in terms of the format, which is very common to a lot of narratives. And in many ways, Equiano was a pioneer of that. It was 2 volumes, so it was pretty substantial. His role was really to re-energize the first wave of the abolition movement. At this stage, the abolition movement wanted an end to the slave trade. They believed that if the slave trade was brought to an end, slavery would naturally atrophy. of course, it didn't happen. He lectured in Ireland in 1791. And again, if you know anything about European history, you'll know this is the age of revolutions. France had just been ignited into revolution 2 years earlier, in turn very much inspired by ideas of liberty that came across the Atlantic from America. So he's in Europe, in England, at a time of a lot of political and revolutionary action. Because of his background, he could write about what we call the Middle Passage, the passage from Africa to the Americas from firsthand. Again, not something many other Black abolitionists could do. And this is just some of his writing. And if you're interested in this, I would urge you to read his narrative. And it's pretty heartbreaking. If I just go to the final sentence, the shrieks of the women and the groans of the dying rendered the whole a scene of horror, almost inconceivable. So, again, a very important eyewitness account to the horrors of being enslaved. So he came to Cork in the 1790s, and this is an image of the beautiful city of Cork at the time. And he writes very little about his time in Ireland, even though after he returns from Ireland, he publishes more versions of his narrative. But all he says about his time in Ireland is, I shall only observe in general that in May 1791, I sailed from Liverpool to Dublin, where I was very kindly received, and from thence to Cork, and then travelled over many counties in Ireland. I was everywhere exceedingly well treated by persons of all ranks. I found people extremely hospitable, particularly in Belfast. And Belfast at the time was really a hotbed of Republican nationalist activity. And this is just a newspaper cutting. It's not the best image, but you can see this is him being referred to in the Belfast newsletter. So they're describing his narrative. And what's really interesting about Equiano was he was hosted by members of the United Irishmen, the group that wanted to establish a republic in Ireland, the group that led the failed uprising in 1798. And Equiano's own progressive ideas were very close to their ideas. And they wanted a republic. They were also active supporters of ending both slavery and the slave trade. And this is just a typical toast from the United Irishmen. They had many get-togethers and many toasts. And this is one, Mr. Wilberforce and the cause of our fellow slaves, the Negroes. So they were very much early abolitionists. And again, it is something that Equiano could very much agree with and support. And Equiano came back to England. He at one point was under danger of arrest because of his radical activities. And so he sort of disappears from public view. He publishes no more editions of narratives, and he dies 1797. We know he died in London, but we don't know to this day where he was buried. But what's really interesting about Equiano is he is remembered very much so in London, other parts of England, as an early activist on behalf of both abolition and human rights. To this date, he hasn't been remembered so much in Ireland, but hopefully he will be, because again, he came at a really important time in our own history. That's Equiano. Jumping forward a few decades to this incredible man. He's sometimes known as the lost prince of abolitionism because he's been so overshadowed, mostly by his great friend, Frederick Douglass. So this is Charles Lennox Riemann. And Charles was different from some of the other Black abolitionists because he was born a free man. He never knew enslavement. And when he lectured, he mostly talked about prejudice against Black people, as he had no first-hand experience of being a slave. He was a supporter of the white abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison, as was Frederick Douglass. And Charles visited Ireland in 1841. He'd first come to London. He spent a year lecturing in London. And while in London, he lectured alongside the great Daniel O'Connell. And he said that he had never heard anybody as brilliant as O'Connell when it came to lecturing. Like many abolitionists, Charles was a great feminist and believed that women were the equal of men and that women should have suffrage, the right to vote. For some people, this was too radical, and it actually led to a split in the American abolitionist movement. But again, very, very progressive. He came to Cork September 1841, and he lectured in the beautiful courthouse in Cork. And this is a welcome to him coming to Cork, that the citizens of Cork have long been convinced of the debasing influence which slavery exercises on the physical, moral, and religious state, both of those who inflict and those who suffer under it, that consequently we welcome every prudent aid towards abolishing so enormous an evil, and recognise in the lectures of Mr. Charles Lennox Riemann an exposition of the mischievous results of slavery in America, which must be useful to the progress of anti-slavery cause everywhere. But especially important to us in this locality, where hundreds of our fellow countrymen annually emigrate, to put them on their guard against the seductions of slave-holding cupidity. So that is a Cork newspaper welcoming Charles to Cork. And the final sentence is interesting because, as you probably know, Irish Americans did not support abolition, and some of them very openly supported slavery. So this is also an appeal to you listen to Charles Riemann and learn from him, and then support abolition wherever you can. And this is Riemann speaking in Cork. And again, he's very passionate in what he says, and what I love about him is he always addresses women and men equally, which is not always the case. I call upon every man and woman of every creed and class and party, solely because they were men and women, and because they exercised a powerful influence in the cause of freedom, and because in the people of no other country was the exercise of that influence more benefiting than the people of Ireland. And again, he talks about the people of Ireland having a special affinity with the cause of the oppressed and with championing their desire for freedom. So he, like so many Black abolitionists, really found a great empathy amongst the people of Ireland. And one of the things he did, and as other Black abolitionists did, he not only re-energized the men to become involved in abolition, he very much re-energized the women. The women of Cork were already pretty active, and afterwards they started to get even more engaged. This is an appeal of the Cork Ladies Anti-Slavery Society, and they are appealing to ladies of the southern part of Ireland. And they're asking women in the southern part of Ireland to actually make goods. And you can see children's frocks, stockings, handkerchiefs, gloves, aprons, caps, fancy articles, toys of every description, mottos, devices expressive of Irish feeling, etc. And these were to be sent to Boston, and they would be sold at a great bazaar, again organised by women of Boston, and then this money would be given to the American Anti-Slavery Society. And the women of Cork were very, very active for decades in sending these little goods, which were very highly valued, to Boston. Later they sent some to Rochester when Frederick Douglass moved there. But if you're from Cork, these might be names you recognise. Mrs. Beamish, she was the president, and Miss Jennings, she was one of the secretaries. And it was the Jennings family who actually put up Frederick Douglass when he visited Cork in 1845. So the whole family were very much involved in the abolition movement. So Charles returned to America at the end of 1841. The beginning of 1842, there was a massive, massive meeting at Boston, and a young, new rising star of the abolitionist movement was there, of course, Frederick Douglass. And one of Charles's missions when he was in Ireland was to collect signatures to a petition, which was first signed by Daniel O'Connell and by Father Matthew. And the petition was an address to Irish Americans to ask them to support abolition. And Charles Riemann managed to collect 70,000 signatures from men and women in Ireland. And this address was unveiled in Boston at the beginning of 1842. It was quite controversial. Not everybody approved of it, including members of the church hierarchy in America. And so this address to Irish Americans failed. Following his return, Charles Lennox continued to lecture in America. He lectured with Frederick Douglass. The two men became great friends, and Frederick's third son was actually called Charles Lennox Douglas as a gesture towards their friendship. He also lectured with his younger sister, Sarah. but sadly he suffered from ill health, so he wasn't as active as he had been before he went to Ireland. And I was just happy. I was trying to see if there's any plaque to Charles. Sadly, there doesn't seem to be. From my perspective, he definitely deserves more recognition. So he may not have a plaque, but he does have a hoodie in his honour. So if you want a hoodie that says Charles Lennox Riemann, they definitely exist. So my third Black abolitionist is the incredible Frederick Douglass. What can you say about him? And his famous line that I have to say he stole from Daniel O'Connell was agitate, agitate, agitate. And if you don't know anything about Frederick Douglass, you will at the end of this week. But as you probably know, he was born into enslavement in Maryland in 1818. He never knew the day or year of his birth. As an older man, he chose Valentine's Day, the 14th of February, to be his birthday, hence Black History Month in America, one of the reasons why it's in February. As a young boy, he was taught his ABCs. He then self-taught himself to read and write, and he knew that education was his pathway to freedom. He also knew that through education, he could no longer stay a slave. He planned a few times to escape, and finally, aged 20, he escaped, helped by an incredible, brave, free Black woman, Anna Murray. He arrived in New York, called for Anna Murray. They married, and his surname, his birth surname was Bailey, and at that point he changed his surname to Douglass. So Frederick Douglass was born at that stage. He started to lecture. He lectured alongside Charles Lennox Riemann, and he was just brilliant. And he was so brilliant that people doubted his story. So in 1845, he published his narrative, which propelled him into the limelight, but it also put him in danger of being captured. And so he was persuaded somewhat reluctantly that he should leave America and go to the United Kingdom, where he would be safe. He travelled to Liverpool, August 1845. He stayed 2 days in the port, stayed in a temperance hotel. He was a big supporter of temperance. And then he sailed to Dublin. And he came to Dublin because Irish Quaker printer Richard Webb had offered to reprint the narrative so that Frederick could sell it and would have some income during his time away from home. And if you can see the statue, it's absolutely beautiful. It's created by the sculptor, the English sculptor, Andrew Edwards, who's created many other stunning sculptures. And this is unusual because it depicts Frederick as a young man. It depicts 27-year-old Frederick, the age he was when he went to Ireland. And it's the cloak he's wearing is modelled on the cloak worn by Daniel O'Connell. The waistcoat he's wearing is modelled on a typical waistcoat worn by President Abraham Lincoln. And Frederick's outstretched right hand is an exact replica of President Obama's right hand. And in his left hand, Frederick is holding an Irish edition of his narrative. So it's a deeply symbolic statue. It's almost 9 foot in height, almost 8 foot in width. And I'm happy to say it's currently in Quinnipiac University. Sadly, Frederick is in isolation like the rest of us, but we hope that when we move on in the world that Frederick will travel. So, but currently Frederick is having a little rest at Quinnipiac. So Frederick travelled to Cork in October 1845, and again there was great excitement even before he had spoken in Cork on abolition. And this is from the Cork Examiner. Mr. Douglass, to hear whom the meeting has been called, is a most eloquent and effective speaker. When we heard him last evening in the festival in Globe Lane, Temperance Hall, in honour of the very Reverend Theobald Matthew, and were delighted with his calm, forcible manner and his frequent bursts of fervid eloquence. And as we have no doubt, he is as effective on the subject of slavery as on that of temperance. We can promise our citizens a happy intellectual treat. And I think those 2 words are so lovely, or maybe 3 words, happy intellectual treat. And as we know, audience flocked to see him, and often there would be standing room only. People would be flowing out of the doors, literally, to hear this really eloquent young Frederick Douglass. When he was in Cork, he spoke in a number of locations: Temperance Hall, Lloyd's Hotel, City Courthouse, Wesleyan Chapel, Temperance Institute, and very famously in the Imperial Hotel. When he left, the ladies of Cork organised a soiree to him, and on his departure from Cork, the Mayor of Cork, Richard Dowden, gave him a ring, which Frederick wrote very movingly about because he had never owned jewellery before. So this ring really symbolised so much to him about what his time in the island meant to him. He used the word transformative, that for the first time in his life, he felt like a man and not a chattel. And when he was in Cork, he spoke about his great hero, who he had briefly met while he was in Dublin. And he said, "I cannot proceed without alluding to a man who did much to abolish slavery. I mean Daniel O'Connell. I feel grateful to him, for his voice has made American slavery shake to its centre. I'm determined wherever I go and whatever positions I may fill to speak with grateful emotions of Mr. O'Connell's labours. I heard his denunciation of slavery. I heard my master curse him, and therefore I loved him." So a very, very powerful tribute to the island's great liberator. So later life, Frederick lived to be 77. He advised 6 presidents, including President Lincoln. And as a thank you, when President Lincoln was assassinated, Mrs. Lincoln gave Frederick her husband's favourite walking stick, which he treasured. In 1889, Frederick was appointed Consul General to Haiti. Haiti, very much inspired by events in France, became the first Black republic in the world, but it was very badly treated by other countries, by America, by Britain, by France. And they went from being one of the richest islands in the world to one of the most impoverished. And Frederick was always intrigued and fascinated by this Black republic. And so he spent almost 2 years there. He resigned in protest when he realized that the American government wanted to recolonize part of Haiti. And just as we know from his speeches that he made when he returned to America in 1847, he never forgot Ireland. And to his final day, he often referred to Daniel O'Connell and to Daniel O'Connell's great achievement in winning Catholic emancipation. So even though in 1845-46 he only spent 4 months in Ireland, it really influenced his political thinking for the rest of his life. And the plaque you see is actually in the Imperial Hotel, which I'm not sure if it's open or closed at the moment, but certainly when it's open, go there and have coffee, and you can visit the room where Frederick Douglass lectured, one of the spaces he lectured in Cork. And Frederick Douglass, the day he died in February 1895, he'd actually been to a meeting that day for women's suffrage, and the women gave him a standing ovation. He came home to have dinner with his second wife, Helen. He was about to return to another meeting that evening, and he suffered a heart attack. And of course, people mourned him throughout the world. So my 4th and final Black abolitionist is a woman, the very beautiful Sarah Parker Riemann. Sadly, we only have 2 images of her, and this is one of them. And Sarah was born a free person of colour in Massachusetts. As I've already said, she was a younger sister of Charles Riemann. She made her first anti-slavery speech when she was 16. A few years later, she attended a theatre in Boston, and she was thrown out on grounds of her colour, and she actually sued the police department for manhandling her. And she got massive amounts of press, and she won her case. And she was very, very adept at using media of the day. So she was very feisty. She was incredible. She was an activist like her brother for human rights and for women's suffrage. And as a woman, she could speak in that unique space, talking about women who were enslaved. So she performed a really valuable role. She was also incredibly articulate, charming, and bright. And she visited Ireland in 1859 on the eve of what was to be the American Civil War. And this is just a description of her. Again, she created great excitement, and she did not disappoint. When she was in Dublin, she spoke in the beautiful rotunda rooms, and you may see the image of them there. And this just says that the final sentence, she was listened to with marked attention throughout and was repeatedly and warmly applauded. And just a number of her Dublin lectures, some professors from Trinity attended, and they said she was one of the most talented speakers they had ever heard. And Richard Webb, who she also stayed with, said she was the brightest of every abolitionist he had met, except for Frederick Douglass. He rated them to be intellectual equals, but he said Sarah had the much nicer personality. So This is Sarah in Cork, and she also spoke in the Imperial Hotel. And this is, again, great excitement before she appears. This is an advert in the Cork newspaper. Miss S. Riemann, an American lady who lectured with great success in several towns in England and recently in Dublin to large audiences, will give 2 lectures in the Imperial Hotel. And again, another advert. We understand that Miss S. Riemann, an American lady, has acquired a distinguished reputation as a lecturer on this subject, and she is to lecture here at the Imperial Hotel this evening and on tomorrow. We anticipate that her efforts in the cause of humanity will be rewarded by the attendance of a numerous auditory. And again, like Frederick, wherever she went, she attracted packed audiences. So, and this is an age, this is the 1850s, where it was still accepted that a woman's place was in the home. So she was really breaking boundaries. What she was doing was incredibly brave, and she saw herself as being equal to any man. Part of her lecture, she talked about slavery in the United States, and she seemed to forebode that this awful war is about to happen. Every hour, the division between the northern and southern states was becoming wider. Even if slaves were well fed and looked after, the principle remained the same. Thinking, reasoning beings, daily sold by an auctioneer, women and children struck off to the highest bidder was wrong. Give to the cause your sympathy and moral suasion. And again, being a woman, Sarah was able to appeal to other women to become activists, which she did very, very effectively. So Sarah, in later life, after her taste of freedom, she knew she could not return to the United States. She had intended to be away for 12 months, but she never, ever returned. Instead, she went to university in London. Even though she was a free Black woman, even though her family were fairly affluent, she had been denied a proper education in America on the grounds of her colour. After she studied in London, she moved to Italy, and she wanted to be a physician. And there she trained to be a doctor and was an incredibly successful doctor in Italy. At the age of 50, she married an Italian man, and she stayed in Italy. Later on, she was visited in 1886 by Frederick Douglass. The family were friends throughout their lives. And Sarah died in Italy. And this is a plaque to Sarah, which is in Italy, near to where she was buried. And I know there are a number of people who are very anxious that Sarah should be recognised in Ireland. And hopefully we can report on that in a few weeks' time. So that is my 4 incredible Black abolitionists. And at this stage, I'll hand you back to Adrian. And just thank you for listening. Thank you. And I'll stop the share.
That was wonderful. Thank you so much, Christine. So we have here a little bit of time to talk to each other, but I want to make sure that it's not just me talking, that we have some questions coming in. We've got 2 questions here already. So please do keep on contributing some questions here to Professor Kinealy, and I will do my best to sort of convey those across. So just to start there with our last person, Sarah Parker Riemann, I'm just struck here, obviously, by the somewhat forgotten role that not just of abolitionists, but of female abolitionists, especially in Cork, women played in advocating anti-racism here during the 19th century. Despite those intersections between women's rights and abolitionism at the time, I'm sure they also had to navigate some appropriate gender norms of what women could do and what women couldn't do. With that in mind, I'm thinking about Sarah Parker Riemann and how she stepped into that. Was she able to talk about certain things or do a different pitch of abolitionism or move in different circles than maybe male abolitionists could?
Yeah, I think one of her strengths, and again, not every woman could have done this, but she was really fearless. You see that from Sarah as a teenager. And she talked about the abuse of women slaves, that yes, all enslaved people were treated badly, but that women were treated particularly badly and they were vulnerable. And she talked about issues, being raped by their masters, of their children being taken from them. And she spoke of it as only really a woman could. And she very much appealed to other women, to understand what would it be like if your children were taken from you. So in that sense, she filled a really important niche. And again, it was, in some ways, it probably would have been seen as inappropriate for a woman to broach those sort of issues. But I think, like Frederick and the other Black abolitionists, she just did it in such a way, in such an articulate way. She really brought her audience with her. And you can see from the quotes, I had to take these speeches from newspapers, but you get the audience reaction. And I keep them in because I think it's really interesting to see how the audience are really engaged with these speakers in a way that is, I think, very powerful. But for Sarah, she really did speak to and about women in a way that male abolitionists couldn't have. So in that sense, her role, pretty unique. There are a few other women abolitionists, but she is in the forefront of what she was doing.
Very good. I'm also thinking here too, I mean, I'm speaking to you today from Bucknell University in Pennsylvania, and William Penn converted to Quakerism, I think in Shanagarry, which is where his father owned land in East Cork. Cork still has, I think, a very vibrant Quaker community. You mentioned Webb, obviously, the Quaker printer up in Dublin who published Douglass's Irish edition of his narrative. How integrated were the Quakers with evangelical Protestants in Cork? This is, I can get onto a follow-on question here in a second of these amazing folks navigating these crazy intersections and stuff. But with regard to Quakerism in Cork and abolitionism, were they very much sort of still involved at this point in time?
Yeah, Quakers in Ireland are really interesting and just incredible in terms of their progressive views. So at the time, the 1840s, there were only about 3,000 Quakers in the whole of Ireland, and mostly in the towns and mostly on the East Coast. But they were a very strong network, and they had a really strong network overseas. And when it comes to the famine, because we know the famine, the potato blight comes 1845, end of 1846, Quakers in Dublin, the Bewleys, etc., form a relief committee, and Richard Webb is involved. So people who'd hosted Frederick the year before, very much involved in giving relief. So that idea of compassion and humanity and putting themselves at risk is very much there. But Quakers very much were involved in the early abolition movement. So when I talked about Equiano, I talked about Wilberforce, and the committee he formed, I think 1787, I can't remember the exact date, the Society to Bring Slave Trade to an End. And the 12 men who formed his committee, I think 9 of them were Quakers, and 3 of them were Christian evangelicals, and they were called the 12 apostles because of their religious whatever. So Quakers have always been at the forefront of progressive issues, not just abolition. We know prison reform, women's rights. They were very active in peace forums. Some of the abolitionists attended peace conferences while they were in Europe. So just a whole range of issues. What's really interesting about the Quakers, I talked about Catholic emancipation, and Daniel O'Connell achieved it for Catholics 1829. But Quakers as nonconformists could not be members of Parliament. So when Frederick stayed with people like Richard Webb, even though they were incredibly successful as business people, they could not be members of Parliament. And I think these experiences really helped Frederick to refine his thinking about what oppression meant and what white oppression meant, and to sort of see differences with oppression. And when he was in Limerick, he sort of spoke about different forms of oppression very eloquently, of course. So the Quakers were really important because it was Richard Webb who welcomed so many, Richard and his wife Hannah, you have to pay tribute to Hannah, but they welcomed so many Black abolitionists, white abolitionists, other progressives to Ireland. And then Richard Webb also produced many narratives, even though he often did it at a loss, not with Frederick, but with other people, he did it at a loss. And then he provided that network so that when Frederick, for example, travelled to Wexford, to Waterford, he stayed with other Quaker families in Limerick also. When he was in Cork, he stayed with the Jennings, they were Anglican. But just again to show how brilliant these abolitionists were, when they went to Belfast, as many of them did, not all of them, but many of them did, Belfast was different again because the Belfast abolitionists were not Garrisonians. They did not support William Lloyd Garrison. They looked to the British and foreign anti-slavery society, which was much more conservative. And most of the abolitionists in Belfast, the North, would not have supported Daniel O'Connell. But Frederick and these other Black abolitionists sort of seemed to get all these, the intricacies of Irish politics, of Irish religious differences, etc. So it was just interesting to see how Frederick in particular, negotiated these differences and still was able to impress various audiences. Yeah. Frederick impressed the Belfast Abolitionists so much that Garrison got nervous that he was going to defect. So Garrison thought he was going to lose his superstar because he negotiated those boundaries so well.
Interesting too. I mean, you talk about this, how interconnected Ireland was, especially through its ports in the Atlantic world, and Cork is a place, at least in the 1700s, that I think it was connected into slavery, at least through provisioning. I don't think Ireland had any slaving companies, but Belfast obviously is another place with a history very much sort of connected in with the British Empire and with slavery and everything else. But it's so interesting how they were able, these abolitionists were able to visit these places and tap into these networks and these connections and sort of aim a pulse back the opposite way in quite powerful ways wherever they went. One last quick little thing, and then I've got to make sure we get onto some questions here for our last 20 minutes. Their daily lives, as these folks, I'm just thinking of their daily lives, these abolitionists as they traveled around Ireland. It must have been very difficult to be, talking about Black freedom and being free yourself and saying how important this was. But at the same time, how did they make a living? They would also have been dependent upon white abolitionists and white audiences. And sort of there's an interesting juxtaposition there, right? In terms of at the same time, how did they live on a daily basis? And where did their money come from?
Yeah, so they had none. Frederick never charged, or he rarely charged an admission. I think he spoke at the music hall in Dublin, and because they had to pay something, there was an admission fee. But in general, there was no admission fee. That's, he did not want to make money. He just wanted to get his message out. But he made money through his narrative. And what's really interesting is Richard Webb, he turned about the narrative. He had it ready by the end of September, and he printed 2,000 copies, which, as a historian, as an academic, you probably think, we think 2,000 copies is a lot. It sold within a few weeks. And so there had to be a second and possibly a third Irish edition. So Frederick's books were very popular. That gave him his income. People put him up. So in that sense, he was looked after. And we know that Frederick, for the first time in his life, he really had some income that he could enjoy, because we know when he went to Scotland after he left Ireland, he felt homesick and he bought himself a fiddle, taught himself to play, and that was his way of cheering himself up. And back to the women, Frederick then, he was in Scotland, he came down, taught in England, and he was incredibly homesick. But a number of women, again, it's women abolitionists, purchased his freedom. They went through the really complex legal process and they raised the money to purchase Frederick's freedom. He wouldn't have had enough to do that. A number of other Black abolitionists I didn't speak about, they came specifically to raise money either to buy their freedom so they could return to the States, or one came to purchase his family's freedom. He'd escaped, but he wanted to purchase his family's. So he appealed to collections at the end. So they appealed in different ways, but for Frederick, his main income came from sales of his narrative.
Very good, thank you. Okay, let's move on to some of these questions here. So, see, Kieran here is asking, he's sort of thanking you here for your amazing research and just asking how you sort of found all these Frederick Douglass speeches.
I literally just combed through newspaper after newspaper. So I knew the time slot he was there. So it was 4 months. So a lot of them are online, but not all of them. So I did a mixture of online, which can bring its own challenges, and then in person when I could go to the archives. And I just systematically went through newspapers and then just transcribed them. And just looking for keywords, and just as I fitted in the times, I knew he was in certain places. Yeah. And then not just Irish newspapers, British newspapers covered some of them, American newspapers. Garrison loved having his stars on the transatlantic stage, so Garrison would cover them. And then Garrison made Frederick promise to send back letters. So we have Frederick's, I think there are 5 main letters back to Garrison, which Garrison published. And again, you really see what's they're sort of beautiful. But after only 2 weeks of being in Ireland, Frederick wrote to Garrison saying, I feel transformed, and for the first time I'm not treated as a colour, I'm treated as a man. And you sort of see this blossoming of Frederick. And then 2 weeks later, he writes, and he's really excited because that night, 29th of September, he'd met his great hero, Daniel O'Connell. He'd gone to a repeal meeting. At the end, he'd been introduced to Daniel O'Connell. He'd been invited on stage, made this speech, which he ended by saying, agitate, agitate, agitate. But you could just feel his excitement in the letter. And he always talked about, that was one of the reasons he'd stayed in Ireland. So, and then, again, one of his really beautiful letters after he leaves Ireland, and he reflects on his time in Ireland. And it's, again, very powerful because he says, I came to Ireland as a single issue man. I was only interested in abolition, but now I've been in Ireland, I come to see my cause is the cause of humanity the world over. So you really see the transformation of Frederick from an abolitionist into this, what we know as this great human rights activist.
Very good, thank you. Yeah, no, I know full well myself with those old microfilm things, when you try to blow them up and you still can't make out what some words are when they're all blotted, you're like, oh my God, what is this? So no, wonderful.
Backwards or whatever.
Yeah. Okay, we have a question here from Com, who's asking, just in terms of how famous is Douglass in the United States? So how is he sort of thought about in the US, and how do you talk about him in the United States? I mean, you've mentioned some of the Irish-American sort of history there, but...
Yeah, so it's really interesting because in the last 2 years, I would say, his fame has grown so much. Maybe it started with President Obama. Apparently, this may not be true, but apparently President Obama removed the statue of Winston Churchill from the Oval Office and replaced it with Frederick Douglass. And we know when President Obama came to Ireland in 2011, he really spoke very movingly about Frederick Douglass, and he linked him with Daniel O'Connell as two champions of human rights. So that was there. But just looking back, I looked at the inauguration speech of JF Kennedy. He also refers to Frederick Douglass, which I think is incredible. 40 years ago. But the last 2 years, and maybe it was Frederick's birthday, in 2018, he was 200 years old, and his own family, I know they've spoken, they will speak this week, and Nettie Douglass, they've been very active in promoting Frederick, in trying to get Frederick's narrative into the hands of American school children. And I just think there's been a growth of interest, and it just seems Frederick's everywhere in a way that when I first moved to the States, 10 years ago, he really wasn't. And I think it's really exciting. So if any of you watched the inauguration of President Biden a few weeks ago, the fantastic young poet, Amanda Gorman, and she talked about Frederick Douglass being an influence on her. So it just seems his influence is growing and growing all the time. Rochester are going to name an airport after him. In Belfast wants to erect a statue to him where he spoke Rosemary Street Church. I know Caroline's involved in trying to name a street after him in Cork. So it just seems Frederick's legacy keeps on growing, and deservedly so. He was just brilliant. So to me it's really exciting that people are embracing him. And my final word is because I teach undergraduates, and I think Frederick is one of those people who is timeless. He just doesn't lose anything. His language, his story just grows with time, and I think he speaks to young people in a really special way. So to me that's also very powerful.
Yeah, no, we have questions here, thinking about, current issues of social injustice and people of color and Black Lives Matter, and the fact that, this is so relevant, and it resonates, so well. And you can imagine, how these folks would be thinking today, and how far we've come, but how far we obviously still have to go, unfortunately, Yeah. There's a question here with regard to Father Matthew, who's obviously from Cork. And this question here is just sort of, obviously, Douglass went to temperance meetings, he got the medal, he hung out with Father Matthew, but then Deirdre here is pointing out that Father Matthew then didn't fully support abolitionism because of biblical references and religious guidances with regard to slavery. Do you know any more about that issue or the falling out between those two people?
Yeah, so Frederick, even before he came to Ireland, was a great admirer of Father Matthew. He attended a temperance meeting near Dublin, heard him speak, and then when he was in Cork, he had breakfast with him. And when he was in Ireland, Frederick actually took the pledge with Father Matthew, who gave him a silver pin, even though Frederick didn't drink anyway, but the symbolism of taking it. So he was a great admirer of Father Matthew. And I talked about the petition that Father Matthew and Daniel O'Connell had signed, 1841-42. So Father Matthew was seen as one of the great champions of abolition, but he did come to America in 1849, and he refused to speak out or to give his support to abolition on the grounds he was a guest of this country and it was part of the legal framework, so he didn't want to speak out against him. And Frederick was really disappointed and felt it was cowardly, and so the two men fell out at this point. I don't think they ever reconciled. So yeah, sadly that friendship came to an end in 1849. And around the same time, Kossuth, the great Hungarian champion who came to America, and abolitionists fell out with him because, similar to Father Matthew, he wouldn't publicly denounce slavery.
Yeah. Got a question here from Pam, who points out that there's been suggestions that Equiano made perhaps quite a bit of stuff up in his narrative. And do you have any thoughts on those issues?
Yeah, there is some doubt that he was born in Africa. There is some people have suggested that he wasn't. He made up his story, and it's impossible to prove. And he does describe his narrative as a thrilling narrative, and it reads almost like an adventure story. But I think, in a sense, he feels that's what his audience want. That the truth has to be presented in this sort of adventure sort of style. So it's impossible to know whether all of it is true, or we could say that with some of the other narratives. If I wrote my narrative today, I'm sure I'd have to fill in the bits I can't remember. So that's the nature of a memoir, I suppose, or a narrative, that you have to fill in some of the bits to keep the story flowing. But I think it's, unless some new evidence comes, it's really impossible to know. But I think basing my admiration of Equiano on what we do know about his life and how he really contributed to that first wave of abolition. He was such a human rights activist. He spoke so compassionately about people who were oppressed. So to me, that's where I would really focus, I suppose, my energy and where my admiration for Equiano comes from.
Yeah, I'm thinking there, obviously, we know that Equiano was in Belfast, and he was in other places, because he's talked about as being there by lots of other people, and that's corroborated.
Oh yeah.
I'm thinking too how interesting it is here. Irish historiography has been sort of dominated by, sort of a more Catholic kind of nationalism, but it's so interesting how, focusing on these folks not only gets us thinking about abolitionism, but you're in their navigating of everything else at different times. You find yourself thinking about the United Irishmen and what they stood for, and how they're remembered, and how if they feature as much as they should, or you're thinking about Quakers, you're thinking about women. It becomes so much more of an abolitionism. It becomes this means with which to sort of complicate and think through and reassess our Irish history in ways that are obviously crucial for the present, not just with regard to issues of race, but other issues too.
Yeah, and just when you were saying that, it reminds me of Thomas Emmett, who's brother of Robert, and he ended up as a lawyer, an attorney in America. And one of his first cases, which he did pro bono for free, was to imprison a slave owner, a ship's slave owner, and he was a great abolitionist. And before 1798, before he had to go in prison, exile, he wrote about slaves, black slaves, are similar to Irish people because nobody thinks we're capable of governing ourselves. So he framed the argument in a really interesting way. So it's interesting to me that people like Thomas Emmett take it overseas and back to where the problem really is at that stage. So it's really, really interesting.
We have a question here from somebody who's anonymous, but they're asking, did Sarah Riemann have any dealings with the Grimke sisters? and how was her position as a Black woman received by white abolitionists such as William Lloyd Garrison?
Okay, I don't know directly if she had contact with the Grimke sisters. I would imagine she did. I'm just trying to think of when they're all around and the dates. So she might have been a bit younger than them, but I would imagine she did, because these people were really interconnected. They knew each other, they supported each other. Other white abolitionists supported Sarah, and she seemed to have had good friendships with them. And sorry, the second part of the question was,
let me see.
She was by white abolitionists. So
yeah.
Sarah, yeah, so when Sarah arrived in Liverpool, because that was the main port that they came to, she actually wasn't, she'd had a really bad crossing, she wasn't very well. She went to Warrington for a while, just outside Liverpool, and I think one of her first public appearances was in front of the women of Warrington. Warrington in the north of England had a really active ladies anti-slavery society, and they presented her, I think, with a watch, and she just spoke so movingly. Again, that idea of somebody giving her a present and honouring her. So the women, white women abolitionists, seem to really, really admire Sarah very, very much.
Last question here. I think it's probably, we've got to close up here, unfortunately, in 4 minutes, but I'll ask questions from Robert. Just asks, why was abolitionism so strong? I mean, the Irish abolitionists are obviously talked about by Douglas and other folks as being some of the most sort of radical abolitionists. And Robert's question here is, as well, is why did Frederick Douglass and these other speakers, why did their message resonate to such a degree in Ireland specifically? So obviously we've got lots of different types of abolitionists in different places. We've got that colonial context. But it is interesting, right, that all these folks are diehards, in different ways. Yeah. Why is that? Why was it?
Ireland's own history of oppression. And I think the quote I gave from Charles Riemann sort of hints at that, where he says, you people who have fought so hard for your own freedom, I know you will empathise with me. And Frederick sort of said the same, that he's a people who have been oppressed. And Frederick talked about the incredible poverty he witnessed in Ireland. So I think that sense of oppression and that need to struggle. So even the phrase agitate, 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 which Daniel O'Connell used and Frederick Douglass used, it was applicable to both groups of people. So I think it was just that empathy that really brought them closely together. They could really understand that struggle for independence, for recognition, not to be stereotyped, etc.
Yeah, and it brings up that sort of that complicated history again, that we can't put people in boxes, and that it's incredibly nuanced as these folks move around. So let's see if we've got any more. We're down to our last 2 minutes here. Let me just check if there's any more questions that are coming in. What exactly was the family connections, this is from Mary, between the Jennings family in Cork and Anna Richardson in England, who helped to purchase Douglas's freedom?
Okay, I think they were cousins, but I'm not a genealogist or family historian, so I might get it wrong, but there was definitely a connection. So Anna Richardson was, again, based in Newcastle, just welcomed so many Black abolitionists to her home, and she was the one who really organised raising the funds and the legal doings that were necessary to purchase Frederick Douglass's freedom. A few years later, she purchased someone I haven't spoken about, but someone who's also incredible, William Wells Brown, who had to leave America because the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, and Anna Richardson again did that. So, these women were just such unsung heroes, but there's definitely, I think it's the cousin level, there's definitely a family connection. I just wouldn't know precisely what it is.
Well, that's wonderful, Christine. Thank you again. I think we're sort of run out of time here, unfortunately, but that was incredibly enlightening. Thank you so much again for taking part in Douglas Week. This is wonderful.
Thank you.
I'm sure we've got other things going on this week. We might be roping you into some other stuff. So thanks again, everybody, for tuning in.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, everyone. And thank you for the questions.
Yeah, thank you also from us, from the Douglas Week team. It was really enlightening. Professor Kinealy, as always, your talks are so inspiring. So I really enjoyed this. Thank you so much. Learned so much again. So thank you for the inspiring talk. And thank you, Adrian, for hosting the conversation. And Christine, we'll see you later on in the week again. So stay tuned for more from Christine. And thank you so much. And we invite you to our next events following now and then at 8:30 GMT tonight. So thank you so much, Christine. Thank you so much, Adrian. And have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye
you.
now.
Bye.